So today I wanted to cover Mermail. I want to talk about the deck theory behind how Mermail works and how well positioned or not it is in the Rage of the Abyss format. I want to pay special mention to two things. First is the typical Mermail problem being really good going first, but struggling going second. And then secondly, the main driving forces of the current meta, which is probably as a number one, Mulcharmy Fualos, to a lesser degree Mulcharmy Perulia, which is still important, but mostly kind of like relegated to the side deck, unless you're Tenpai. Cards like Dimensional Barrier, which are emerging as kind of counterplay to some of these types of cards, because for example, even though you can search this off of Thrust, if you get Mulcharmied, you have to set it. The same thing applies to Droll and Shifter, because those things don't place bodies onto the field. And so if you get hit by a turn skip type card, you have to have a way to be able to turn skip them, or you have to have a way to be able to make some kind of quarter or half board that actually stops you from dying. So I have a couple different ideas here of how to approach Mermail and some ideas on the theory, and also I have some opinions on how people have approached it so far that I want to get to in this video. So I hope the scope of all that makes sense. I also just want to say that I feel like a lot of the channels that exist on YouTube in general, but especially around decks that fall into the kind of tier of Mermail, where it's obviously not like the best deck, and it's debatably maybe a tier 2 deck, but a lot of channels will really oversell this and be super deceptive about how good it actually is. And I think that that's not right when there are people that maybe are buying cards based on recommendations of YouTubers. And this is even the case for channels that are built entirely around a single archetype, and they still will show completely garbage combo lines that don't play around anything and say like, oh, look at what you can do off of a single prince. And it's like, yeah, if your opponent is sleeping, that's true, but in a normal Yu-Gi-Oh, that's just not the case. So this is more of like a real talk episode here for Mermail. Okay, so right now, let's cover some of the new cards very briefly, and then I will show you two combo lines before getting into what I think are some of the limitations of the deck and things that you can do to adjust the deck to play better into those limitations. So one of the new cards that's very important is called Abyss Shrine, the Atlantean Spirit, which is also a Mermail card. So you can tribute this card from your hand and one Atlantean or Mermail monster from your hand or field. Obviously, these are all cost, because that's how all of these cards work, is they have to be sent to the graveyard for cost and to trigger their effects. And then the effect is you can take a level 7 Fish, Sea Serpent, or Aqua monster from your deck and either add it to your hand or special summon it, and then you're waterlocked from the extra deck. There's another extremely relevant effect, which is a quick effect in your opponent's turn where you can banish this card from your graveyard and discard one card to the graveyard, draw one card. So a couple things that are worth mentioning. Ice Jade Ran Agerine is an Aqua monster, and this one searches level 7 Fish, Sea Serpent, or Aqua, and obviously this is a level 7. And this is interesting because this is a tuner, and it summons out a token that's level 3, which means that not only can you trigger a water monster card that was in your hand by discarding it off of this, but you also get to go into a Synchro 10. Now, probably the best generic Synchro 10 in the game, emphasis on the word generic, is Cheng-Ying, and it also happens to be a water, which is a pretty big deal for this deck, because these cards don't typically type lock you, they just attribute lock you. What's additionally useful about this card in this deck is that the Abyss Shrine card will be a reliable banish on your opponent's turn virtually whenever you want, and so you have a way, an in-engine way, to be able to trigger Cheng-Ying's banish whenever you want. Usually one of the main limiting factors as to how useful Cheng-Ying is whether or not you can trigger the banish in a convenient way. So being able to do that in engine is a pretty big deal. It also takes some stress off of having access to Atlantean heavy infantry, which is like if you're interrupted in some way to where you can't have this card in your hand, this is normally one of the things that out of turn you would want to be discarding to the grave so that you can get a pop. So I feel like this kind of makes sense. And just to tie this back to the current format and the idea that you have to be able to make a board that does something if you get hit by, you know, like a Shifter or a Perulia or whatever, is what kinds of monsters can you make that don't require a huge amount of investment, for example, into a Fualos, but still do something useful on your opponent's turn. So let's say, not in the case of Shifter maybe right now, but sometimes in the case of Droll and with the Mulcharmies, you can actually make a Cheng-Ying. And as long as you have the Abyss Shrine in the grave, you can trigger it whenever you want. And then you're kind of like not that far off of having maybe just a couple other interruptions to be able to actually play. Or you could have something like, let's say you drawn Thrust so that you can search a D barrier after you got Full Lost. just having like a thrust and a Changing may actually be enough to turn skip your opponent or survive a turn to where you can maybe win on the crackback. So that's just like a useful way to start thinking about Mermail in the current format. Now, another thing that I've noticed in a lot of deck profiles is that the ratios of cards people are playing seems to vary quite widely, and I think that there's a misconception around what makes cards good and how many of them you should play. So a lot of people will say, for example, that because Abyss Shrine searches level 7s, you just don't need to play that many level 7s. Like, you could play one Abystius. And I'm not saying that you absolutely have to play Mermail Abystius, otherwise you're building the deck wrong, but I think that you need to think about functional redundancy in terms of ratios. If you get interrupted, which is normal Yu-Gi-Oh, you should expect that's going to happen and build your deck around the assumption that you will be interrupted. You're not going to be able to play cards like Deep Sea Diva, for example. Let me just bring that up real quick. So this is one of the cards that was kind of like a star card back in the day, and this is the biggest hand trap magnet that exists in the world, basically, for this deck. When this card is normal summoned, you can special summon a level 3 or lower Sea Serpent monster from your deck. So typically you would be bringing out like a Prince. But obviously the difference between this and Prince is that Prince sends for cost, because this is, an Atlantean / Mermail type card. And so being able to send for cost regardless of what your opponent does is good. But this doesn't do anything for cost, so just getting hit by an Imperm here is bad. The only argument, in my opinion, for actually playing this card is that you aren't going to draw Prince in the majority of your games, and so perhaps you want a normal summon card in your hand that you can use instead of Prince. And in that case, if you're thinking of this strictly in terms of the stats on opening up those starters, maybe you put in like 2 divas, not even necessarily 3. But then you also have to take into consideration that in any scenario where you might be able to search or draw into a Prince, then you still would be using your normal summon on this card because it's the best normal summon in the deck. A couple other things that I've noticed too is there will be cards like Deep Sea Minstrel that people will play as part of a combo. So this is a tuner and it's a level 3. And so one of the things that people are doing with this card is they will use Coelacanth, and I'll show a combo with this, to have 3 the 2 main cards that you use are Coelacanth. So this card, once per turn you can discard a card, special summon as many level 4 or lower fish monsters as possible from your deck, but they cannot declare an attack and their effects are negated. And so this is like useful for synchroing or just like getting bodies on field for some other purpose. And then this is the other one, the other new card, which so this has a once per turn you can detach 2 materials from this card, send a water monster from your hand or deck to the graveyard, that's cost, return up to 3 cards your opponent controls to the hand. By the way, this works relatively well with Dark Ruler. You may have noticed that some decks aren't as good with Dark Ruler because they don't have a lot of board clear. So like traditionally runic variants like, runic White Forest and stuff like that, those decks wouldn't be super good with Dark Ruler because they didn't have a way to get rid of those monsters, and so you wouldn't be trading super well in terms of your resource game. But this does work with Dark Ruler, which is just worth mentioning because I'm showing a power spell version of the deck right now. But then the other effect, which comes up in all the combos that you'll see, is if this XYZ summon card is sent to the graveyard, you can discard 1 card to the graveyard. And this is any card, it doesn't have to be a water monster or a monster at all. Special summon 3 level 3 or lower fish, sea serpent, and or aqua monsters from your hand and or graveyard. So this card and Coelacanth are kind of solid ways that you can get bodies on the field. And one of the things that you can do when you have bodies on the field is go into a Synchro 9. So some people are playing Crocodragon, some people are playing Trishula. I feel like Trishula is kind of a win more card because... So like one explanation for Trishula is, let's say that you go for the standard Mooling Glacial line, and then they have a card in the graveyard that they actually can use in the graveyard. Like maybe you hit 2 Fiendsmith cards or whatever the explanation is, and you don't want that there, is then you could then make Trishula, so you would banish a card from their hand, so you're like continuing the hand rip, and you also remove the resource from the grave. I guess it's possible that you could Trishula into a board, like if you had Dark Ruler or something and you were also trying to play a resource game. But I feel like Crocodragon is better generically if you only have space for 1, because this can be good not just going first, but also potentially going second, because this gets to draw cards equal to the number of non-tuners used for Synchro Summon, which will basically be 2 cards. And then it also can discard 2 cards and target a card on the field, destroy, and this will trigger your water monsters too. So, yeah, I don't think one is like clearly a million times better than the other, but I feel like this is probably a little bit more generic than the Trishula, so I feel like it's probably more worth playing. Another thing that is worth consideration is, again, going back to this idea of what are the driving forces in the current meta and how do you adapt your deck to that. So Stealth Kraken is a card that a lot of people have been overlooking because this requires 2 level 4 water monsters. And normally, if you're making Bahamut Shark, which is 2 level 4 water monsters, there's kind of no reason to use those materials, which are basically going to be the Abyss Pike in the deck, to make anything besides Toad, because Toad is so strong. Like, you know, even if you're trading with like an Imperm or something, you're getting their Imperm. And so in the long run, not only is the Toad potentially recycling resources from your grave when it's sent to the graveyard, because you can target a water monster in your grave and add it to your hand, but you can, you know, get their Imperm or whatever it is. So it's kind of hard usually to argue for not making Bahamut Toad, except that Toad says, once per turn when your opponent activates a spell / trap card or monster effect, quick effect, you can send an aqua monster from your hand or face-up field to the graveyard. So that's the cost, which you cannot perform under Dimensional Shifter. So let's say you get shifted and you didn't draw like a thrust or a D-barrier to hopefully turn skip your opponent. Then what are you supposed to do? I'm not saying that you can make an amazing board, but there at least needs to be some kind of backup plan. And Stealth Kraken, this makes all monsters on the field become water, and then during the main phase you can destroy a water monster your opponent controls, and then it also burns them. So this card is like, the effect is actually good because it doesn't target, and it is, you know, playable into D-Shifter. So, you know, this is something that's worth considering, I think. You have to play Abyss Gaios no matter what, because before Supreme Darkness, that's really the only way that you can make Poseidra Abyss. So that's kind of like hard locked. Bubble Reef, I'll show this in part of a combo too. Not everyone is on this, so there's not consensus, but this does help your resource economy a little bit. Usually what happens is you will end up trading your Mermail King Neptibus, which gives you targeting protection to whatever it points to, kind of like Samorg did if you played Bird Up back in those days. So you give that up, which doesn't matter that much if you're on Toads, because usually the Toad will be sending itself for cost, and so it doesn't really matter if they were targeted or not. For this, which will give you a draw. I'm not really convinced on if this is objectively the best way to play the deck, but it is worth considering because it does help your resource economy. Okay, last things that I want to show before getting into the combos is that this deck does play bricks, and you have to be honest about that and think about what that means for your deck building. So Heavy Infantry is probably the least bricky of these bricks because during your main phase, you can normal summon a level 4 or lower Sea Serpent type monster in addition to your normal summoner set. And that means, for example, if you had this in your hand and you were worried about bodies for, let's say, making a link play or whatever, you could actually normal summon infantry and then additional normal summon the prince, and whatever happens next, you at least have 2 bodies on field. I'm not saying that that's good, but I'm saying that it gives you flexibility with more bodies on field. Whereas Muling Glacier, for example, is absolutely horrendous if you go second. It is like a true brick. And if you're going first, even though it will be fine if you draw this, and in some cases the search may have been blocked, but you drew it anyhow so you can still resolve it, but you still would never want to draw this. This is a card that you want to search as part of the combo if you get that far. So this card is not ideal. And then there's Coelacanth, which is really not... This is probably the worst card in the deck to draw. Obviously it's a water monster, so you can discard it, but you can say that for any other water monster. And this doesn't really help you do anything when it's discarded. So, yeah, I feel like, you know, this is really... And then you also have the Abyss Sting Triana. So this one is basically like a Monster Reborn. And it's probably more generically useful than any of the other equip cards because, you know, you could use a Monster Reborn going second or going first. So there's not an issue with that. And then you could like side in the other Abyss cards, like the Spell Negate. You could also have in the Trap Negate, especially if you think people might be unevenly matched. Those cards probably fit more naturally into the side, and this is okay in the main. But still, like, this doesn't do anything by itself, and it's not a water monster. So I almost feel like this is just too much. It's almost not acceptable. And the reason that I'm not playing Virtue Stream in the main is for that reason. You know, imagine you're going second and you're drawing a bunch of cards like, you know, Coelacanth and Muling Glacier and also Virtue Stream. You know, like the chance of you drawing at least one of those cards is still substantial. So you don't really want to do that. So I feel like this card might work better in the side for when you know you're going first, and then you have your Icarus Attack type card. So that's what I think about that. in terms of siding stuff, I feel like Gozen Match and those types of cards that are so broken that you can single-handedly win off of that should be there. It doesn't matter if they're at 1. You should probably still play them. And then also Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood. So this card may actually even be worth maining at 3 in the deck. So this card is searchable off of Pike, because this says when this card is normal or special summoned, you can discard 1 water monster to the graveyard, add 1 level 3 water monster from your deck to your hand. So the Dogwood is a water monster, and some of you may recall in recent formats, people were playing this card as a way to basically get an extra turn. It can be pretty useful against decks like Tenpai, where it's obvious that they're trying to OTK you, and they're also very prominent in the format. But I feel like in principle the same thing applies, where, you know, if you were stuck playing Mermail and you couldn't establish a proper board, or you couldn't break their board, then having Dogwood to give you 1 more turn, especially if you're on a breaker build where you could win or lose based on a single draw, could actually make sense. So I haven't tested this yet, like in the main at 3, but I think that, you know, you could consider that given the fact that you don't have a huge amount of space in here. The last thing that I'll say is Fuelos is obviously a better card than Purulia, and I think that just because Purulia is a water probably doesn't warrant it in the main deck over Fuelos. You could main deck both Purulia and Fuelos because this is also a water, and then stick to the idea of having a bunch of breakers and maybe play a little bit more than 41. Like maybe you'd go to 42 or maybe even 43. So, okay, let me show you some combos now. So, the first one is like a basic combo where you've drawn basically Prince and nothing else. So this is not a realistic combo into hand traps, but this is what everybody is showing. So you would Prince here, and obviously just keep in mind that, you know, if you get interrupted at any point, the whole point of having other cards in your hand is that you can continue the combo if those cards are functionally redundant. So if you like decks like Sword Soul or White Forest, this will be very, very similar. So here we dump the Bodyguards, and the Bodyguards gives us a Pike. We have searched something for the Pike to discard, so the Pike can discard the Dragoons, and most people are showing at this point in the combo that you will search Abyss Shrine, because this is like a starter extender type card, which is useful for continuing your combo. But I feel like you should also pay attention to the fact that the Deep Sea Minstrel is kind of the only way that you can play around a lot of hand traps. You can't play around the stuff that you can do in the standby phase, like the Shifter or the Mulch Armies, but I feel like if you either draw the Minstrel or you can search it early without destroying your combo, you should probably do that. I'm just showing this because we've just drawn blanks basically for the rest of our hand. So the Dragoons will search us the Mooling Glacier, and here the Abyss Shrine will get rid of the Prince on the field and itself to search for a level 7. Now, in this space, you could also be going for the Ice Jade card to be able to make, you know, like a Chenging, for example. But here, I'm just showing you a slightly longer combo. So here you can make the Bahamut, and this gives you the Toad. So where this could be useful is, even though you summoned a bunch of times already, having whatever other engine pieces in your hand to extend through whatever hand traps and forcing something by time Toad gets on the field is still useful. So yeah, here I'm searching the Minstrel again. The earlier you can do this, the better, because you will at least have hand knowledge, and maybe in the best case scenario, you'll have stopped your opponent from destroying your entire combo to begin with. I feel like of the main cards I've mentioned, between like Shifter and the Mulch Armies, D-Barrier, and Droll, the one thing that this is most useful against is Droll. Like, if you hard draw this card, then you can obviously stop them from drolling you, so that's worth thinking about. Okay, so here we search the Gund, and this is another of those cards that is really not like a high value card, it's just part of the combo, but because it's usually useful, it's not really a brick, so I don't really count it as one of the hard bricks, but, you know, if you didn't have to play this, then you would not play it. So another thing that you should always keep in mind is that this card has a level modulation effect, which is useful not only for going into rank 7s, but because if Mooling Glacier is a material, when it's sent to the grave, you will not have to skip your battle phase. So normally, if this face-up card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. So like if you were to link this off or whatever, or it's destroyed in some other way. But as a material, it's not considered a card that is leaving the field. So it's kind of like a way to cheat that out. So here, you make the Poseidra Abyss card, and you link with this. And so then remember that this effect says, if this XYZ summon card is sent to the grave, you can discard 1 card to the graveyard, any card, so it can even be like an impulse. Special summon 3 level 3 or lower fish, sea serpent, and or aqua monsters from your hand or graveyard. So here you'll see that we've discarded the Gund, and that will special summon, in this case, an Abyss Pike. So here we can make the Croco Dragon. A lot of people would make the Trish in this case, because then your opponent would lose an additional card, and if they had something useful in the grave, like a Kozaki, then you could get rid of that card as well. I kind of like the Croco Dragon, though, because after the draws, it stays useful on your opponent's turn, and so it's another form of interaction. It's also another way to be able to get rid of something like a heavy infantry, or the Atlantean Marksman, for example, if you were siding that or playing it or whatever. So here you can make another Toad off of Bahamut Shark. If you had been shifted, you wouldn't have gotten to this point, so this is not where you would think about making Stealth Kraken instead. That would be more of like an earlier game type of play. So here we search the heavy infantry, which is a very important part of the end board, because it's an additional location for interactions to happen from. Here, I'm actually not sure if this makes sense. So we get rid of a Bahamut Shark and the Neptibus, which is giving us targeting protection to make a Bubble Reef. So the Bubble Reef says during each standby phase, you can banish a water monster from your graveyard or face-up field and then draw 1 card. And that's basically the only thing that's relevant about this. It does, each time a monster is banished face-up, gain 600 attack until the end of the turn, but I feel like this isn't super important because the attack is already relatively high. And then the other effect isn't going to come up most of the time because you're usually not going to have a banished Marincess monster. I guess you could set it up to where you're banishing your Coral Anemone, which is obviously a Marincess card, and then, you know, if this were to survive until your next turn, you could use this and special summon the Coral Anemone, and then you could be, you know, linking up or, you know, getting another body with the Coral Anemone. So maybe that's the best thing to banish off of that card. But yeah, I don't know if the targeting protection is worth the extra draw, because you could, for example, still have the Neptibus over, you know, whatever 3 monsters. And then, so that just to show you here, if you had made a Chang'e, you probably wouldn't be triggering it off of this. You'd be triggering it off of the this Shrine, which you see here, where we banish this to draw a card, and we're sending the heavy infantry, and so that will give us a pop there. So that's kind of like a basic overview of what that combo looks like. What you'll also notice is that most people will just Imperm or Veiler or whatever the Prince, and this is probably the best thing that they can do if they don't have like a super high impact hand trap. So here what I'm doing is I'm searching a Shadow Squad that I'm not going to use. So let's just say that they Imperm this, and really all we got was to send that Shadow Squad. So what this means for our combo is that we didn't get the Dragoons in hand, and so that doesn't allow us to get an additional search. But here we can still use the Pike, and here we can get access to our super ancient Deep Sea King Coelacanth. So this card is useful because what we can do is we can discard a card and get our other 2 Pikes from deck, and then we can make the Bahamut still, and we can link up into the Coral Anemone, which gives us the Mermail King Neptibus. Okay, so here we get another Toad, for example. Here we get the Monster Reborn, and this gives us another level 4 so that we can again go into a Bahamut and then make another Toad. And so at this point, you know, you're in the same position where I guess you could make Bubble Reef, but, you know, I don't really know if it's better or not. I guess it depends on exactly what you have underneath the Neptibus. So those are a couple very generic combos that you'll probably see in most places. I think that maybe you could argue that it is correct to play at least a single Talents in this deck. In fact, it is probably even worth just going straight up to 42 from the beginning, just so that you have an additional search target off of Thrust for when it is live. And the difference between 41 and 42 is statistically insignificant, so this is probably far more correct. I think that Call by the Grave is a pretty good card this format, because there are lots of things that you can hit in the grave that are doing useful things regardless of whether you go first or second. And it's one of the few cards that actually stops your opponent from using a Mulch Army or a D-Shifter or a Droll. So it's probably too good to not main in decks like these that can immediately lose to them. Obviously, Thrust, like, statistically gives you more chances of having a very, very strong counterplay, like, for example, by searching the D-Barrier. But, you know, Call by allows you to continue playing instead of just having to search a blowout and then hoping you don't lose. So, I hope that video has kind of made sense. I feel like the Mermail cards are good and they do have potential. And if you build it this way, the chance of you drawing, you know, at least 3 engine pieces, or if you're going second and you have 6 cards in hand, even at least 4 engine pieces is pretty decent if you have, you know, this kind of ratio where you're really maxing out on all of the really good cards. But there's still a problem of like, do you want to play the Deep Sea King Coelacanth just because you may get impermed on the Prince? And then the other thing is, you know, one of the cards that would be really good, flex on the dice roll, first or second, that helps you play through stuff like that is Talents. But because cards like Imperm and Dominus Impulse are so popular now, I feel like Talents is kind of indirectly nerfed, and it's not likely to be live as often. But as long as hand traps are popular and like the best decks are on hand trap builds, this card is probably still strong and it will remain flexible on the dice roll. So that's all I have for now. I am probably going to see if I can get some gameplay with this and show that off next, but thanks for watching.